I'll be very brief. For the last 20 years, all the projects I do is like I do only few things, I know only few things, but they span very long periods. So the Arctic work is going on 20 years, 18 years and ongoing. And I'll share just a few things why I'm talking about the Arctic. Ashley started with, and anyway, I am tired. I forgot to thank Ashley for inviting me. We are dear friends. I invited Ashley to my university last year, and he gave an incredible presentation on extinction. And so I'm happy to be back talking with you all. And my dear friend here, Yates McKee, whom we have known each other for almost 8 years now, something like that. So it's really good to see that Ashley and Yates are working together. We will be working together also on something else, which I may or may not mention. But anyway, okay, on to the talk. So Ashley began with the IPCC reports, so numbers. What do these numbers mean? And I won't really give an art talk. The only reason I brought that book is to show, hey, I do exist in the art world with very, 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 very thin thread. So that was my kind of sort of self-promotion, self-advertising into the art world, where my presence is virtually nil. That said, so numbers. So the IPCC report, 1.5 degree, and the difference between 1.5 to 2 degree. And this was not planned because Ashley and I are friends. But I happened to begin my talk with also numbers. So when you see that number 1.5, we're talking about a global average. But when you take any particular region, a specific region, and then a specific period of time within a year, we are talking about outrageous shift. Outrageous, beyond any scientist's imagination. So these scales are truly mind-blowing. So in this case, 2 years ago, this data is 2 years old, but nevertheless very relevant for what I'm going to share with you, is the temperature over the Arctic, the entire circumpolar north did something very unique. How many of you know this? A couple of you, 3, 4. Is most part of this part of the Arctic, over Alaska, Canada, Greenland, sort of this side of the Arctic, the temperature was 36 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. Whereas that side in Siberia, where also have spent a bit of time in Far East Siberia, was 36 degrees below normal. So this is extreme, like really, really extreme. So this was not just air temperature. At the same time, Mark Cerisi, who is the head of the National Ice and Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado, a very, very significant and important climate scientist, said that, well, it's not just the air temperature. The ocean temperatures at the time was, in parts of the Arctic Ocean, was being measured as 25 degrees above normal. This is just, so when you see these 1.5, 2 degrees, know that those things are averaged out numbers that do mean something, that do have significance, but the real on-the-ground reality, including where I live, New Mexico, things are out of whack, like literally out of whack, already. So that's why George Monbiot last year, for various reasons, different reasons, he said, forget about using the staid word, climate change, start calling it what it is, it's climate breakdown. Okay, so what does that got to do with you listening to me about the Arctic in New York? Why? So that was actually Amy's interview today made sense, even though it was not really planned. Neither did I know that that was going to be planned. She spoke with me first, and I talked a little bit about the Arctic, which I'll get to in a moment. And then the real big part of this morning's program was really, really good on Hurricane Michael that just hit Florida and its impact. Of course, you all probably know the aftermath already, but then to connect the two. So what's happening up there directly impacts you right here, directly impacts the whole Earth, because so this is from a National Academy of Sciences, actually National Research Council, the publication arm of the Academy. On the very first page, the Arctic system serves as an integrator for the Earth's physical, biological, oceanic, and atmospheric processes with impacts beyond the Arctic itself. So that's it. So the Arctic is the most critical integrator of our planet's climate system. So if the Arctic goes to hell, we all go to hell. I mean, it really is that's bad. It is. But that said, as Ashley did this about Trump, who is listening? So while all of this is unfolding, and I'm only giving you really a snippet, like just a snapshot of the larger picture, is while this is going on, at the same time, there is an extreme move to kind of put petrocapitalism on steroid in the Arctic. On steroid, yeah. So petrocapitalism and steroid. But, so one more thing on that point is none of these things should be surprise, even though it doesn't get covered in the New York Times or the Guardian, it should not be a surprise. So I started my first Arctic visit was 2000. We were already seeing tremendous impact of climate change. But this book came out, called The Earth is Faster Now, Indigenous Observations of Arctic Climate Change. Technically speaking, the first public document on Arctic warming is called Impacts of a Warming Arctic that came out in 2004. So this particular book, this is a Smithsonian book, preceded that even that report by 2 years. So indigenous observations of Arctic climate change preceded the public document. But the key thing was a resolution that was passed by indigenous communities in Finland, which said the reason, I'm just paraphrasing it, the reason we are not being able to make much of a change on climate change is because the rest of the Earth's citizens have not yet seen any significant impacts of climate change. While we, the Arctic communities, are already seeing these impacts. So there is this temporal gap that it is creating, and a spatial gap. Now, of course, to everybody's surprise, 16 years later, all of that has changed. Every part of the planet is experiencing. So back to that putting petrocapitalism on steroid is, so President Trump's energy policy, the narrative is that to make America energy dominant. Now that's a bit of a hyperbole because Obama did this already. Under the Obama administration, America became the world's largest energy producer. By 2012, US took over, both Saudi Arabia and Russia. By 2015, far exceeded. So this thing is a bit of a, just like anything else, every politician wants to take credit for what they are. This credit should be given to Obama, not Trump. Nevertheless, energy dominance is a powerful narrative and a powerful organizing principle. But then on top of that, Zinke, the Interior Secretary, went to Alaska last year at an oil and gas conference and said that energy dominance, path to that energy dominance will come through the great state of Alaska. So that's where it all began. So all of that, so all of Arctic Alaska land, and what he didn't say is that path of that Alaskan path is actually in the Arctic. He didn't say that. So it's not all of Alaska, but the Arctic, both the land and the seas. So since then, through various legislative and executive actions, they have opened up. We are fighting like hell right now. Is one after another executive decisions and legislative decisions were made to open up these areas to oil and gas. So I have said that so these actions collectively constitute both an epic ecocide and an epic ethnocide, and I'll mention the two in a moment. To destroy biological nurseries and feeding grounds of global significance in the midst of climate breakdown and mass species extinction and die-off is an epic ecocide, a colossal crime. And the ethnocide, because to destroy food security, and Marina talked about food security. So food security is a big thing for Arctic communities who are really, really struggling right now. And endanger indigenous lifeways at a time of great ecological and economic challenges is an epic ethnocide. The way Arctic indigenous communities are now articulating it, they're calling it already genocide, like they're like, hell, we're going to go to, anyway. That said, this is very briefly, because I'm so glad that all three presentations will hopefully all come together, because like Marina also is working on climate, energy, food, so this is, and the non-human. So this is about the non-human, the Arctic Alaska, and not to romanticize it right now, at this very moment, is truly a biologically a remarkable place, both in diversity of species and its populations is astounding. Even though it occupies a very small part of the entire circumpolar north, this part hosts the largest diversity and the most populous of each of the species. So just to give you a couple of examples, on the northeast, all those whatever icons you see, the caribou, that are 200,000 strong. That particular herd, porcupine herd, makes the longest land migration of any land animal on the planet. And indigenous communities all over that region of Northeast Alaska, Northwest Canada depend on that herd. I'm just giving you one species. Over here on the Western Arctic is 230,000 strong Western Arctic caribou herd. 3 indigenous communities as well as non-indigenous people from 40 communities depend on that herd. 50 million, more than 50 million seabirds inhabit that area. I'm just giving you just quick a few snippets. And this entire thing, the largest wetland complex of the entire circumpolar north is right there in the middle called Tassapakwik wetland. It's just astounding. And because of this incredible diversity of life, these human cultures have evolved. All obvious, right? With this much richness, of course people will build. But these human cultures, various indigenous communities, at least 3 different tribes, have developed both not just nutritional dependencies, but cultural and spiritual dependencies of the village. And very intricate kinship with, Haraway uses that term, but the term kinship goes far, far back than Haraway. But kinship with non-human and the human belongs here, that goes back a very long time. So, what are we doing? So I haven't really slept much in the last year, and just one quick story that's sort of a little feather of my cap. So as you know, throughout the country, cities and states are moving away and disacknowledging Columbus Day and calling it what? Indigenous Peoples' Day. So last year, Alaska celebrated in Indigenous Peoples' Day, and I had the weirdest of invitation of all, and probably the most satisfying one, is University of Alaska hosted a panel to celebrate their inaugural Indigenous Peoples' Day. And I was invited to speak at that panel, who is not indigenous to Alaska, not indigenous to the Americas, and I don't know why the hell I was on that panel, but it felt good. It felt good. I was with all other panelists who were indigenous women. It felt very good. But since that panel, no, not in a bad way, sorry. It's all getting recorded. I mean in a very honorable way. Because my presentation, and I didn't plan it that way, my presentation was all about indigenous women changing the Arctic narrative. It was a very gendered presentation, but it was all about indigenous women. Artists, writers, activists, policymakers, all indigenous women. So the talk was entirely about indigenous women changing Arctic narrative. All that said, since that point, I haven't slept much, because from that point on, we took on the fight. So just a very quick set of things. So I wrote a piece in Tom Dispatch, but I show, this one is very beautifully, they did a nice layout. So it was first in Tom Dispatch, then came out in numerous other magazines, including the London Diplomatic. I've been on Amy Goodman several times, as well as this morning. So we are at it. We thank Amy very, very much, and Democracy Now! For giving us the space to highlight some of these struggles. Soon thereafter, I organized a conference at my home institution, the Last Oil. It was the first national convening to address Trump's war on Alaska's Arctic. And we called it Trump's War. 29 indigenous activists, writers, artists, scientists, indigenous and non-indigenous, they came. The website, I would encourage you to take a look if you have the interest. We built up in a very quick, like something like this would have taken a year and a half to plan. We did it in 6 weeks. So everything was just, we'd just been rolling. Then soon after that, I co-organized with the historian Finis Dunaway, dear friend in Canada, a letter campaign called Scholars for Defending the Arctic Refuge, which was quickly endorsed by more than 500 scholars from 20 countries, representing more than 40 academic disciplines, which then both Finis and I testified in Washington, D.C. on June 15, and we formally submitted the letter to the Department of Interior's process. And then that very month, Macarena Gomez-Baris, and she'll come back at the very end, dear friend, who teaches at Pratt, organized or edited a volume for social text, which Ashley did one few years ago, which also I contributed, called Beyond the Extractive View. I contributed a piece on multi-species justice, a little bit of theorizing of what it is that we are doing, providing a conceptual frame and providing a little bit of the history of what multi-species justice actually means. And this is very different than where multi-species studies research has so far been, coming largely from anthropology, great scholars like Anna Singh, Tom Van Duren, and others. This is actually praxis. So the way I'm articulating multi-species justice is not theory, it is praxis. And then this is actually over there, you will see the book. So this was not even going to be in a book or anything like that. I just casually asked my students in my spring course, hey, do some response to the symposium, not a final project or a semester-long project or anything like that, a small assignment, midterm assignment. They wrote a few things. I was like, whoa. And these are undergrad, mostly undergrad students and some graduate students as well. Great stuff, including this art by Diné artist who really captured, really encapsulated the topics we were discussing, from colonialism to religion, to oil, petrocapitalism, to the idea of liberty, and all of that, and packed it in one small drawing was quite powerful. So on Indigenous Peoples' Day this year, we released this book. The entire book is accessible and available online for free, both at web and print quality. And Ashley mentioned, this has just opened. On the left is my only thin thread to the artwork is the Porcupine River caribou herd that I was talking about, on which the Wichin indigenous communities of Alaska and Canada depend on. And it is a human rights issue. They have been fighting this for more than 3 decades now. And as I speak here, my dear friend, who is the executive director of the Wichin Steering Committee, is also here in New York. We are doing, actually I'm doing mostly activist stuff while here, along with lectures. So this was, I don't even have to say what multi-species justice means. This is what it looks like on the ground, because multi-species justice, the way I'm trying to articulate, is praxis. So this was, Department of Interior went to Alaska on March 7th to advance the oil leasing in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and refused to consult with the indigenous communities, did not meet a single one. So the indigenous communities organized a rally, and this is Fairbanks in February, damn cold. Organized a rally, organized primarily by the Defend the Sacred, and I'll say a little bit about what Defend the Sacred is, because I want to bring it back, and hopefully it will be a segue to Karthik's talk, because I read your paper that Ashley circulated, and this is where I'll bring back to the more activating the, so Defend the Sacred is largely young women, largely indigenous, but also non-indigenous. It is coalition. In Alaska, this is an Alaskan movement to boldly uphold our sacred connection to each other, the earth, and all living beings. We are not environmentalists, we are human beings, and we are demanding human rights over corporate rights. And what they do, the environmental community, with all the good things they're doing nationally on many of these campaigns, not to take anything away from that, no grassroots organizing has been going on. So all of the grassroots organizing over the last several years is entirely by Defend the Sacred. And the Defend the Sacred is largely these young activists who are coming from few different groups, one of which is Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition. So that comes right back to where some of this discussion hopefully might lead to is, and again the picture kind of tells it all, is, so it isn't, our biggest fight is actually not just energy transition, but resistance. We are fighting because if each and every one of these projects gets instituted and even launched, we are talking about stuck for 50 more years in each one of those.
Are there any ecological attorneys involved in this movement?
Yes, big time.
Okay.
Yeah. So bring that up because that's where our biggest fight is legal. So much of this, because with the Trump administration, our fight will be, there is grassroots work, but a big part of the fight will be legal fight. But, and I can get to that actually since you asked that, but back to that energy thing. So Alaska is a petro state. It's like Saudi Arabia, it's like Louisiana or whatever. So any politician, doesn't matter Democrat, Republican or independent or green, even probably a green candidate will say, yes, I'm all for drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, for all I know. Because it is a petro state. So you speak up against oil, you are out the door. You speak up against oil, you will get fired from university. That's how it's been going right now. Yeah. And in my multi-species justice piece I wrote about, where two University of Alaska Fairbanks faculty members, both biologists, this is 1950s I'm talking about. What I mentioned is probably the first grassroots environmental justice campaign in this country, had published their paper, not necessarily in support of the indigenous communities, but that put a stop to the most powerful government agency of its time, the US Atomic Energy Commission. The project is called Project Chariot. Both of them got fired by the University of Alaska. So University of Alaska has a history of doing this. So right now, even my friends who are faculty, I can't name any names, are literally on thin threads. So nobody is speaking about anything. You can't, you will get fired right away. All that said, because 80% of Alaska's state budget comes from petroleum industry, 1/3 of the job comes from there. That said, there are people in Alaska, and this is not like what people in New Mexico or New York would say. People in Alaska are trying desperately to make a transition. This is why Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, Defend the Sacred come in. There is also legislative support coming. So Tom Begich is, actually he's a poet, but he's also a state senator, gave the most powerful speech, a historically significant speech on February 21, available online on YouTube. And the reason I remember that day, because I opened the Last Oil Symposium at University of New Mexico the very same day. Earlier that day, Tom Begich spoke at the state senate. Powerful. How and why and what are the mechanisms to move Alaska beyond oil. Really, really practical, powerful speech, and a very necessary one. Not that any part of it will get implemented, but a necessary thing to do. So that is one thing, just to show that it's not all in support of that. But before I go into that, I do want to address your question. Can I have just a minute, and then I'll wrap up my last slide. Yeah. So the big fight, because some of these that are already executive actions, like this morning, the reason I was on Democracy Now, because on Wednesday, the Trump administration approved the first production facility in the offshore federal water of Arctic Alaska in the Beaufort Sea. There's a lot of complications around that. But nevertheless, if it moves forward, it will be the first ever actual production drilling, not exploration drilling, in Alaska's Arctic Sea. So it's very significant from that point of view. But what it means is many other things. So that's why I was this morning talking with Imi about that and its significance and the larger significance. So where is our fight? Whether it's the Arctic Refuge fight or any of that, it's in the legal realm. So it is in the legal realm. So there are organizations, so Trustees for Alaska, and right now as here I speak, my dear colleague Vicky Clark, who also spoke at the Last Oil Symposium, is the Executive Director of Trustees for Alaska, the main legal organization that provides support to indigenous as well as environmental groups in Alaska. Very distinguished history of winning big battles. So Trustees is the Alaska one, very, very respected organization. And then Earth Justice is the national one that is providing a lot of the legal. Then there is a difference. So there would be, we are going to file lawsuits like left and right lawsuits would fly. And I can say this probably publicly by now. So legal suits are coming. It's inevitable, it's coming very shortly. But there is another part of the legal campaign that I cannot quite talk very publicly, but I'll just allude to it, is the government-to-government relations with indigenous nations are being violated. That cannot be covered. That's a separate part of the battle. And so one thing, because much of these battles we are losing, whether it's a Keystone or this or that, is one example before us is the Trans Mountain battle that just took place in Canada, where the indigenous communities in partnership with legal organizations defeated the government of Canada, not the corporation, the government. So that is right before us. And the reason is that the Canadian government did not consult adequately with the indigenous nations. That was the argument, same argument. So I have a reasonably big piece coming out. Actually, we just saw the layout yesterday. It's really quite beautiful. From Technosphere magazine. It's a publication of the Haus der Kulturen in Berlin. It's going to be published November 6th. So we lay out a little bit of some of these things. But so legal is, so there is a separate government to government. I cannot talk about that right now publicly, but it's all coming. That's where one part, but also grassroots. You can't just fight legal, because the Trans Mountain, if any of you had followed that campaign, while those lawsuits were going on, there were incredible organizing where academia got involved in Vancouver, big time, not academia, I shouldn't use that word, but academics. Scholar activists did get very heavily involved. So even though law is always being abused and misused and this and that, but it is one thing we still have. Unless and until, and that's what they're trying to do, is get rid of NEPA. So their real big fight is to probably basically neuter NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And they're trying that. But that's a long way to go. To get rid of NEPA will be a hard way to go. They basically made EPA defunct and institutions defunct, but the laws have, even though the laws are very weak and diluted and whatnot in many cases, but they're not gone entirely, not yet. So anyway, with that, the last thing is that another half, so I work basically on two areas. One is the climate crisis, indigenous rights, and conservation. The other is extinction. So this will be, which is Ashley's big area of research. So I'm giving this public lecture at Pratt next Tuesday, where I'm proposing a new frame to think about the extinction crisis. So this is a more of a conceptual frame. Along with it will come a global project. So we're just starting at a very, very modest level. And the reason for this, in my 18 years, as I'm doing all this Arctic work, I'm also engaged with 2 other geographies. I just don't get the time to release books and whatnot. But I have witnessed 3 mass species die-offs. 2 of those, more than 90% of the populations perished. One of which New Yorker called the greatest wildlife mass mortality event of our time. So all 3 geographies have experienced this. So finally, I'm conceptualizing this entire crisis, because the problem is all of the extinction debate, including the great book by Ashley, we have failed to make extinction a public crisis. And what does that mean? How do we make it a public crisis? So I'm looking at all these various dimensions: spatial dimension, temporal dimension, emotional dimension, and many other threads. So that would be that talk, and I understand it will be live stream, but that's it. Okay, enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Subhankar.